Welcome, friends. It gives me very great pleasure on behalf of the Institute for Conflict Analysis and Resolution to welcome you to the 9th annual Lynch Lecture. My name is Kevin Clements and I'm directing the Institute. It gives me very great pleasure to welcome tonight Professor Johan Galtung to be our 9th Lynch Lecturer. Johan, as most of you know, was born in Norway 9 years before the Second World War. And his Norwegian birth, like that of compatriot Elise Boulding and many other important Norwegian scholars, is not only interesting but vital to understanding something about his life and work. Norway and Norwegians, Norway, for example, had to struggle for its independence from both Denmark and Sweden. And that struggle, is this sound system working all right? It's sort of a bit echoey, isn't it? Is it all right? This struggle for independence from both Denmark and Sweden gave Norwegians a certain toughness of character and independence of spirit. And ever since the sort of final act of secession in 1905 from Sweden, Norwegians have had to pursue their national interests through very skillful internationalism. Norwegians, like New Zealanders, and here I'm speaking as a New Zealander, or indeed anyone from small and strategically vulnerable countries, know what it is to articulate and promote national politics, art, culture, literature, music, while living under the shadow of larger and more powerful countries. They also know what sorts of survival skills are necessary to retain independence and maintain equitable relationships with their neighbours. So it's no accident, therefore, that Norway and all the other Nordic countries do very well in terms of international aid and development issues and in terms of articulating other global interests. Johan was undoubtedly conditioned and has been conditioned by this, but in his own unique way has also contributed to Norwegian globalism and internationalism. A second formative experience for Johan was the Second World War. He was old enough to experience and to understand the German occupation, and as part of this, the traumatic deportation of his father to a German concentration camp. These kinds of early experiences undoubtedly were influential in helping shape Johan's later intellectual and political interests in war, peace, and injustice. As a student, he was profoundly influenced by the Norwegian philosopher Arne Næss, who not only introduced him to the giddy world of ideas and theories and stretched Johan's sense of what it meant to be a committed intellectual, but also encouraged Johan to make global sense of Gandhi, the subject of last year's Lynch Lecture. The Norwegian government also helped this endeavour by calling Johan to do military service, which he refused, and for his refusal spent 6 months in prison, which enabled him to finish his first book on Gandhi and to begin his lifelong dedication to building a non-violent world. Johan, as you'll see tonight, tonight's lecture, is a Renaissance intellectual. He started his academic career in mathematics, which gave him a solid appreciation for logic and rigour. Instead of applying this to the abstract worlds of physics or pure maths, however, Johan decided to direct his attention to the social sciences, where most of us are mathematically challenged. He wrote some extremely important pieces on the philosophy of the social sciences, on the logic of inquiry, all the time honing his taxonomic and theory-building skills, but he never forgot his concern to build a world where fear, injustice, and evil are replaced with trust, justice, and peaceful relationships. Very early on, therefore, he decided that he would dedicate himself to the task of ensuring that peace research was as academically rigorous as any other academic discipline, only more so. He was concerned to establish that peace research represented a unique combination of solid teaching, theory, and practice. And he made many very important and vital contributions to the field. He was the founder, for example, of PRIO, the first international peace research institute in Oslo. He was the founder of the Journal of Peace Research, which remains the leading academic journal in the field. And he produced endless provocative and path-breaking essays in peace research and social research. Most of us count our publications on a few pages. This is Johan's bibliography up until 1990, and it's another 5 years to go. In all of this, Johan's been concerned to engage the issues in ways which make sense to people, but more importantly, in ways which will transform relationships and situations. Right from the very beginning of his work at PRIO, he's been committed to exploring the conditions for peace by peaceful means. There's no point in trying to kind of search for peace by non-peaceful means. And he's never shirked from trying to refine what's meant both by peace and peaceful or non-violent means. Much of his life, in fact, has been spent refining and understanding these most elusive of concepts. Second, Johan, who is himself a mathematician, a sociologist, a self-trained economist, a political scientist, and a theologue, has worked to ensure that peace and conflict research is interdisciplinary. He, like the rest of us working in the field, realizes that no one discipline is able to help us solve the problems posed by war, militarism, injustice, environmental disintegration, gross violations of human rights, and all the other little evils which afflict us. Finally, Johan has always understood that this exploration has to be truly global in scope. We can't understand how to build world peace from narrow national perspectives, Norway and New Zealand notwithstanding. And indeed, coming from small countries, I think, gives us a very real appreciation of the fact that multilateral transnational institutions are not optional extras for most countries of the world. They're essential to the survival of most countries. Throughout his long and active life, therefore, Johan's pursued all of these concerns with rigor, excitement, and boldness. He's not content, however, to do all this from a university institution. On the contrary, he's been involved in efforts to resolve 24 major global conflicts, and has done so in all sorts of diverse circumstances and with all sorts of key players and stakeholders. To each of these conflicts, he's brought a sophisticated awareness of issues and has shed much light on them, a lot of which seemed totally hopeless at the beginning, and then after he started unpacking and decomposing the conflicts into their constituent parts, many of them seemed to be much more tractable. So, in addition to being a peace and conflict researcher and a practitioner, he's also been a strong peace advocate and peace educator, someone equally at home talking to political leaders as to a group of students. He told me earlier on today that he took a peace studies round the world program, which involved 35 students in 32 countries over how many period, of 2-week period or something astonishing, in order to highlight major peace and economic challenges. That's the kind of thing Johan does, and the experiences are such that individuals come through them feeling that they are very much part of a global cosmos. And I can't end this introduction without talking about Johan's wife, Fumiko Nishimura. She's been a critical factor in helping him think, write, and talk about the deep cultural divide between East and West, between the Occident and the Orient, between West and Eastern religions, or what Johan calls hard and soft religions. She's challenged him to think afresh about the ways in which different cultures frame issues of war and peace, and their own marriage is a unique blending of East and West. So without any further ado, therefore, it gives me very great pleasure to introduce you to Professor Johan Galtung, Renaissance thinker, pioneer peace researcher, educator, and advocate of peace educator and advocate, and global citizen par excellence, and our 9th Lynch lecturer.
Very dear audience, dear Kevin, thank you for your very sweet, nice words, undeserved, of course. But I shall now immediately throw it back to you by saying that I'm very grateful to you for not only inviting me here to ICAR, but also for giving me the challenging task, global projection of deep-rooted US pathologies. So I shall try to now guide you through a terrain which is loaded with intellectual minds of different kinds. It's not an unproblematic task to do, and I can assure you it is done out of a spirit of deep friendship and love for the United States of America, but not for all aspects of it. A good friend is one who also criticizes. The person who only bestows praise is usually a beggar waiting for a handout. The British Medical Association, in the British Mental Health Act of 1959, defines a psychopath as somebody with a persistent disorder or disability of mind, whether or not including subnormality of intelligence, which results in abnormally aggressive or seriously irresponsible conduct. So that means that I take as a point of departure violence. And I shall link psychopathology to violence. And the question I'm interested in is what is at the roots of producing this very high level of violence internationally, globally, of the United States of America. In doing so, I have been somewhat inspired by Barbara Tuchman's March of Folly. And those who have read it will remember that she is discussing 4 cases: the siege of Troy and its final conquest, how the Catholic Church managed to behave so stupidly as to bring about a Protestant secession, how Britain managed to behave so stupidly as to bring about United States of America, how United States of America managed to behave so stupidly as to bring about the Vietnam War. She defines a folly as something with 3 characteristics. Number 1, that policy must have been perceived as counterproductive in its own time. In other words, it's not a question of hindsight. Number 2, there must have been a feasible alternative course of action. It must have been available at that time. Number 3, the policy was not person-dependent. It was not just a question of one stupid politician or despot. It was, as I would say, more structured and actor-dependent. Now, this is her point of departure. She goes through that. Painstaking detail, fascinating description, and like most historians, with very poor theory. So what I shall do is also to define something, but I have 3 other points. I'm concerned with violence against one or more parties abroad. I'm concerned with the fact that non-violent alternatives are not seriously considered, although they are available. And I'm basically concerned with a fascinating thing, namely that the policy, which is violent and non-violent alternatives are not considered, is able to mobilize a massive consensus very quickly. Like a George Bush, who got 82% behind the massacre in Iraq. Now, this is my point of departure. And I shall now first treat you to a number of small things that I shall then bring together. And they come in a little bit topsy-turvy fashion. And that's on purpose, because I want to work inductively. So I think we can simply very quickly get started. And here you have something which also comes from the Clements dynasty, in this case from daughter Elwyn. It's an index we put together called WPI, the War Participation Index. It's based on Cohen's Encyclopedia of War, and it simply measures how many times that particular country has been involved in a war. There is no distinction made between defensive, offensive, no distinction made between just, unjust, or any other distinction. In other words, it is looked at a little bit more like that guy who has a tendency to be involved in a brawl in a bar, regardless of which bar he goes into, and who would tell you afterward that that other fellow looked at me, I didn't like the look in his eyes. But of course, it was entirely defensive action. It is then divided by the number of years of warfare. And maybe the country stopped being belligerent, so 1985 is the date of publication of that particular book. As you see, the USA comes out with a gold medal. The top 11 are quoted. Israel is taken from 1947. If you look at, however, Israel and Palestine down to biblical times, it is down among the bottom 11. So you can say that this index penalizes countries with a short history and rewards those with a long history. Otherwise, you see at the top here, USA, Israel, the Ottoman Empire, and Turkey. And that little island in the North Sea with an enormous amount of belligerents hiding under the fog. South Africa, Central America, Russia and Soviet Union, France, Ethiopia, Spain, Italy. We have some of our well-known friends. And you will, of course, see immediately that Europe is very well represented. Now you can ask, why do I say top 11 and not top 10? That's in order to get Norway among the most peaceful at the bottom. Because you and I have been sitting there wondering about that all the time. So now you have the reason for it. All this is, as you understand, entirely objective science. If you now look at it from another angle, namely, you take as a point of departure not these particular data, but you take the list of use of United States Armed Forces abroad, 1798 to 1945, prepared by the Congressional Research Service, Library of Congress, and was actually prepared for George Bush, because he wanted to show that it was kind of normal for the US not to declare a war before you went to war. That point was made very clearly. That one brought up 168 instances, not including anything that had to do with the invasion of Native American territory, euphemistically referred to as settlement. If you now take the period after 1945, not included in that particular survey, it probably ends at about 210. Now, that's a little bit above one per year on the average, but there is a disconcerting trend. For the first 52 years, there were 39 such instances. In the next 50 years, there were 65. And the following 50 years may very well see more than 70. So how the fourth period of 50 years ends, we still do not know. There is an increase not only in the numbers, but also in, if quality is the word, how lethal, how deadly these wars were. In other words, there does not seem to be a pacification settling coming into the picture. We take the next one. And what you now will be treated to is Coleman McCarthy's reflection on ARDIS, the Association for Responsible Dissent of former CIA employees. I have not seen this printed in the US. They had a press conference in New York in December 1987. What I have here was printed in the Manchester Guardian Weekly, the weekly edition. And what he says is this: with the group estimating that at least 6 million people have died as a consequence of US covert operations since World War II, one question rushes in from the cold. With 6 million dead, why not go beyond the banning of covert action to abolishing CIA altogether? 6 million killed outside wars. Is that true or not true? The ARDIS people say yes, CIA denies. We are not yet quite ready for that debate, I think, but I have just mentioned it. Let us now take something more contemporary. Let us take a statement that I'm going to use a couple of times from Colin Powell, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the possible presidential candidate. At the time when he spoke in the Kennedy Center in Washington, and it must have been the 30th of August 1995, it was printed in Herald Tribune the day thereafter. He urged Americans to consider themselves as family, and he got a round of applause by declaring that America had been established by divine providence to lead the world. Now, there are two statements there. One is the way in which America was established, and the other one was the purpose. It should be noticed that the mandate from God is clear in the sentence, and of course we all know about that from the Pilgrims. We all know about the idea of the covenanted country. We all know about God's new Canaan, but this is a very recent statement. Deuteronomy 20, 16, 17, 18, 19. But of the city of these people, and these are the people inhabiting the promised land, which the Lord thy God doth give thee for an inheritance, thou shalt save live nothing that breatheth, but thou shalt utterly destroy them, namely the Hittites and the Amorites, and so on, as the Lord thy God hath commanded thee. that they teach you not to do after all their abominations which they have done unto their gods, so should ye sin against the Lord your God. When thou shalt besiege a city a long time in making war against it to take it, thou shalt not destroy the trees thereof by forcing an axe against them, for thou mayst eat of them. In other words, save the nature. You may use it. Get rid of those people. It's a fairly tough statement, and it is only the kind of mandate that can be given to a chosen people when approaching a promised land. I think we should have something from Buchanan. And it is actually not a quote from Buchanan. It is the night in Houston began when the preacher who introduced Buchanan warmed up the crowd with a prayer that began, "We thank you, Father, that you are not a Democrat." Now, there are two interpretations of that statement. One is about the party allegiance of the Lord, God. Another one, which is another interpretation, probably not correct, is that Pat Buchanan is referred to as Father. Could be both at the same time. They don't exclude each other. Here is a guy in the Washington Post who argues, what is all this fuss about in connection with Cuba? And he says, over the past 30 years, Cuba has sustained countless acts of vandalism and sabotage on boats and planes leaving U.S. shores, and that's on top of an invasion and the attempted assassination of its leader. Now, before that, do Americans forget their own Navy shot down a commercial airliner with 300 civilians abroad during the Iran-Iraq war when it was incorrectly perceived as a possible threat, and this act involved no American territory? As you will remember, the planes were approaching the North Havana sector. They may have been in international space. They were warned by the radio from Havana. They were then insulted by Basulto, who was in an accompanying plane at a safe distance. Then some very double macho Cuban game went on, and the two planes were shot down. Basulto survived. Now, the important thing, and the reason why I show this one, is that the guy who writes it, in my view, is completely right, and he has misunderstood the whole thing. Because he's equating Cuban action with US action. He simply hasn't understood what the game is about. Namely, that there is one law for some countries and another law for others. In other words, by writing like that, he's just proving one of the points in the mind that I'm going to come to very soon. This created a sensation in Europe 1 month ago, maybe 1.5. I have not seen it reported in US papers. The first thing that was discovered was that when Austria became neutral in 1955, by a big power agreement, the 4 European allies, meaning, or the American plus United States of America, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, agreed to withdraw their troops from Austria. Now, it so happened that the Americans left behind 79 weapon depots against the treaty. That was discovered afterwards. But what was then discovered was much worse. Namely, that the Americans had the plans for nuclear landmines around Salzburg. And the two particular spots are pointed out there, ADM, atomic demolition mines. Austria was a neutral country and a kingpin in the whole Cold War game. The ambassador had to go to apologize to the president and the prime minister of the country, and the issue is by no means dead. However, again, the same point comes out a little bit. What does Austria have to do with that? This is United States acting. It was totally against all the treaties that the US had signed, completely against the whole assumption on which the end of the Cold War was built, namely a graduated kind of extension of peace zones. But it was done, and here it is. This is more added for your spiritual enrichment. According to a recent article in the Paris Le Nouvel Observateur, the German daily Die Welt published a letter sent by the Republican Senator Robert Dole. Somebody has crossed out possible, that seems a little bit premature. American presidential candidate, to the director of the Goethe Institute in Bonn. Dear Mr. Goethe, it's my honor to invite you to become a member of the Republican Circle in Washington and join in our discussions of the future world order. I'd also like to introduce my wife, Elizabeth. The director of the Goethe Institute replied, thank you very much for your kind invitation, but regretfully I will not be able to shake the hand of your esteemed wife, Johan Wolfgang Goethe, who died in 1832. Now, this is just for your enlightenment. There is another one which is a little bit along the same line. It's about OJ, of course. And it says, at a very early stage, it says, the most famous defendant who ever lived. I thought Jesus Christ would be a fair competitor. Particularly in a Christian country. I mean, he was a defendant, after all. He was accused of something. Also, in this last 100 years, Alfred Dreyfus also had a certain fame at a certain period. But we are now informed that it has to be number one country in order to produce number one defendant. We can wait with that one. We go to the scheme, so-called. Thank you so much, Dieter. So, this was just by way of introduction. Let me now try to present the kind of intellectual edifice that I'm interested in exploring. You will understand that I'm concerned with, if you will, violence internationally. I'm in this case concerned with violence by the United States of America, but what I say could apply to many other countries. And I'm concerned with its roots, particularly why non-violent alternatives are overlooked, and particularly why consensus is so quickly built. There are many theories to explain it. There is a Marxist theory in terms of the struggle for profit. There is a liberal theory in terms of the expansion of certain values, value space, and having those values cover as much of the world as possible. It's a so-called realist theory that if you have the power, you'll use it. There is even the American excellent proverb, whoever has a hammer will tend to see the world as a nail, and if you have many hammers, you'll find many nails when you look around. And I'm not in any sense saying that they are all wrong. I'm just saying that here is an additional one. So the additional one is a psychoanalytical collective subconscious theory, and it runs, roughly speaking, as follows. You just divide, if you will, a country in people and elites. And you make use of the superego, ego, id scheme. You tie superego to God as the source of your own morality. Some of that will inspire the individual consciousness of the elites. That is one part that is behind the decision-making. But then there's another part, the collective subconscious. So let me now define that. When I say subconscious, or maybe better preconscious, I mean something that is not necessarily mentioned and formulated. It may or may not be repressed in the psychoanalytical sense. Repressed meaning that the person may not be able, him or herself, to bring it up to conscious level and articulation. I'm talking about the kind of stuff that Colin Powell's sentence was made of. By divine providence, to lead the world. Now, it is collective in the sense that a substantial portion of the population has the same subconscious. The exact content I'll discuss very quickly, very soon. Collectively shared means no collective soul or anything like that. It only means that it's roughly speaking the same shared, non-formulated, sometimes repressed assumptions about reality. I repeat, there is nothing in this that presupposes, in a sense, any new concept. It does not transcend the sum of individual subconsciouses, except in one way, namely a similarity. And that similarity is, of course, brought about by the carriers of the subconscious, in terms of the teaching in school, the churches, the way people are brought up, the kind of things they hear every day, and so on, so on. I'll come to that later. The collective subconscious is young. Freud didn't operate with that. Freud operated with culture, but we did not see it so much sedimented so that it could be drawn upon. He certainly operated with individual subconscious, and each individual was a universe in its own right, but with similarities. Similarities in the sense that you could establish teachings and practice about it, but not in the sense that it was necessarily shared. In Jung's thinking, the contents of the collective subconscious is referred to as archetypes. And I now come to the archetypes, and they are called CMT, and CMT stands for chosenness, myths, and traumas. I've been working on that for some time. I find it fascinating. So a CMT syndrome. That means if I should work on an international conflict, I would try to find out something about the CMT situation of the countries. And let me now share with you how I try to furnish the collective US subconscious. So it divides then into the chosenness, the myths, and the traumas. God's new canon, a covenanted country. The promised land is sacred, which means that to transgress on that land is an act beyond any regular type of invasion of a foreign country. US citizens are of a higher kind than others. That means if there is a war, the only number of casualties you have to know about are the US casualties. The US interests are of a higher kind and are in a sense beyond normal critique, simply because the US represents a higher order. And the US is the final arbiter, the hegemon's hegemon. I can now drop some instances. I can, for instance, drop immediately Lord Owen's complaint that the Vance-Owen plan was not accepted by the US. And in his memoirs, David Owen, for whom I personally do not have any particular sympathy, nor for the Vance-Owen plan, communicates to the readers what the reason was. There was nothing about the US in it. The plan simply had the wrong authors. Now, Vance is okay, not quite perhaps. He did resign at some point. Owen definitely not okay. In other words, any acceptance of the Vance-Owen plan would be an acceptance of an other conflict manager, and the US would not stand as the final arbiter. Dayton, Ohio made it just right. It's also interesting that they were not accorded a more prestigious place than Dayton. One could imagine that countries higher up on the ranking scale would emerge from Ohio into more eastern states. Now, the myths have to do with extremely important things that most Americans would believe in. bringing Christianity, civilization, development to pagan backward peoples. Being a melting pot, the U.S. has multicultural. The manifest destiny, North America, the Americas, and for the world, and giving other people, the immigrants, a new beginning. The last point, I certainly have no quarrel at all. But let us have a look at what the second president of the U.S., what John Quincy Adams, had to say in 1811. Not a second. John Quincy Adams declared in 1811 that the United States was destined to be peopled by one nation, speaking one language, professing one general system of religious and political principles, and accustomed to one general tenor of low social usages and customs. In other words, there was in this country one particular form that was to be the form, and the form was the one that was to prevail. Now, that, of course, is not the same as multicultural country. It means essentially a unicultural country, where the origin may be multicultural, but where the result that comes out is different. However, the idea of being multicultural, multi-ethnic, may still be retained as a myth. And the U.S. ambassador to Beograd, Warren Zimmerman, who is famous all over Serbia, when he asked the question, what's wrong about 6th of April? That was the day they wanted to recognize Bosnia-Herzegovina, 1992. The Serbs were shocked. And the Serbs said, what's wrong about 6th of April is that it is the day the Nazis bombarded Beograd, killed 70,000 people, and Yugoslavia I was destroyed. Now, for an ambassador to live in the country not knowing that is not complimentary. But the point now is Warren Zimmerman's complaint, and I think in a sense expressing something very basic. A failure of Bosnia as a multicultural country is a threat to the United States. Now, what does he express when he says that? He uses a basic principle in this kind of theory, the principle of isomorphism. Bosnia has a structure, let us say, multi-ethnic. The United States has a structure, multi-ethnic. For the U.S. to retain multi-ethnicity is for the U.S., if you will, to clone itself, to replicate itself. For Bosnia to reject it is for Bosnia to reject the United States of America. In other words, the U.S. is tested in Bosnia through the mechanism of shared structure, isomorphism. Now here then comes a little point which is expressed in the two words brain and gut brain. You may have picked up the point that the neurologists have relatively recently discovered, partly at the Columbia Presbyterian Hospital and partly at the Royal London Hospital and University of London, that human beings seem to have two brains. Now, one is the one we are used to talk about, the other one is down in the guts. And we know about that one too when we talk about butterflies in the stomach. When we vomit as a psychosomatic reaction or diarrhea, or if you will, other symptoms that are related to that part of the body. The two brains are related. However, the upper brain is perhaps more linked to, let us call it, intellectual centers, where articulation and formulation are present. That doesn't mean that the gut brain doesn't process, but it is more direct and emotional. The Germans call it Bauchgefühle, your gut emotions. And the point about the collective subconscious is, of course, that it is directly related to the gut brain. So emotions come and soar. And when a feeling of threat is established, namely the idea that if Bosnia disintegrates, maybe one day the United States will disintegrate, then action can be mobilized. You see what I'm now aiming at? I'm aiming at those archetypes that can be called upon in order to mobilize strong emotions, and that are sufficiently shared to bring about consensus. Footnote, shared among whom? First of all, among elites, people higher up. Second, among males. In the Gulf War, it's interesting to look at the public opinion polls. The males were brought into step very quickly. The women held out for some months. Finally, the differences disappeared. What had happened in the meantime? I would say those archetypes are less developed among the women, and that the men have them in much stronger degree. The women will probably be brought in through the social psychological ash effect. You know this famous effect, you have 7 or 9 people sitting around a table. You show 2 lines on the blackboard. One is obviously shorter than the other. B is shorter than A. The experimenter says which line is the shorter one. Subject number 1 says it's A, number 2 says it's B, number 3 says it's C. All of them are, of course, bribed in advance to say that. Only the last one is the innocent one who says, are you crazy? You're absolutely crazy. Of course B is the shorter one. The experimenter says, well, since we didn't have consensus, let's try once more. After 3 times internationally, everybody except French capitulate. In France, the idea of being alone is such a high value that there is no way in which they can be brought to capitulate. I'm sorry to say, Americans fall relatively quickly. Now, I've indicated that this collective subconscious is of course differentially distributed. And do not confuse this with anything that has to do with public opinion questionnaires and so on. These are not articulated at the public opinion questionnaire levels. The traumas. I have a list of the following. The War of Revolution after Declaration of Independence. The idea that independence was followed by a slap from a rather disingenuous George III, analyzed by Barbara Tuchman. The genocide, structural side, cultural side on Native Americans, Hawaiians. The enslaving, commercialization, exploitation, repression of African Americans. And I'm thinking now not only of the traumas, enormous, imparted to the Reds and the Blacks, but I'm thinking of the trauma of those who had given the traumas. And that trauma, of course, translates into one gut idea. One day they may come back and do the same to me. You would then expect an almost instinctive reaction of fear in a country where blacks or reds threaten to get power. You would see the CIA immediately in action in Bolivia, fearing that in a country with more than 90% reds and Che Guevara in their midst, something might happen. And you will see what I think is the real reason for the Panama invasion. Why did they go to El Chorillo, to that particular barrio? Noriega was not living there. The people who were living there were black Panamanians, quite radical, marched to the left of Noriega. Exactly the kind of threat that this gut feeling could be used in order to mobilize a consensus around. Next one, the Civil War. Whether you call it a war against rebellion or the war between the states. You would expect Virginia trauma to be particularly high. I'm always thinking, whenever I am in Virginia, of the circumstance that this was the state that was the cradle of the Declaration of Independence. It was in the taverns of Williamsburg that young George Mason was hanging out. And that's where he got the inspiration, through the various types of conversations they had. The inspiration to the Virginia Declaration of Rights, the Virginia Constitution, later on his participation in the Declaration of Independence, and the US Constitution, which he refused to sign because it was not strong against slavery and for some other reasons. George Mason. That was the country, or the state, country at the time, the Commonwealth, with its own governor, of course, that started, if you will, basically the real beginning of the end of the War of Independence, the American Revolution. Ending then in Yorktown, ending down there with the help of the French fleet. Ce monument est dédié aux forces françaises, etc., as it is written there at the bank of the river. And the Treaty of Paris in 1783. And that was the country, after South Carolina had seceded in 1860, joining them, that witnessed the first real battle, Bull Run, Manassas, and that ended with the apocalypse at Appomattox. One might say, and I would say it would not strange as a Virginian to feel badly treated. Is that the way we are rewarded? Now, Virginia is only one out of 50 states, doesn't carry the leading role today in any way, but it carries an interesting trauma. And that doubleness, if you will, of having suffered both of the ones I mentioned, the slap after the Declaration, and the slap when you discover that independence is only once, and after that there will be no more independence. Now that constitutes, of course, a basic ambiguity in US politics. On the one hand, independence is good, on the other hand, secession is bad. The Yankees won. If you follow, let us say, Professor Fisher, in his book, Albion's Seed, perhaps one of the best introductions to deep US politics ever written, and his theory of the 4 British tribes that peopled the United States of America. You can say that it was the select Puritans from East Anglia that won over the landed gentry from Devonshire. It was East Anglia's triumph over Devon, with, of course, the beautiful people from the Midlands, the Bradford gang, the Quakers, playing a major pacific role, third parties mediating, and the only thing wrong with them was only that they were a little bit too few. Right now you are witnessing the Norwegian-New Zealand soft imperialism coming back, and of course it has a Quaker touch from New Zealand, so it is still there, but again, as I said, from a numerical point of view, not very strong. So if you look at this, you would draw the conclusion that the United States would be vacillating whenever there is an act of secession. When Yugoslavia first threatened to collapse, the gut feeling was to stop it. James Baker was lecturing them, keep together. He was lecturing Gorbachev, and in a certain period Yeltsin, in the same way, because it was secession. It was then a question of switching the discourse to independence, and you could make it. Any little bit clever politician abroad would know you shall never speak secession language, always speak independence language the moment you are in Washington. It's the only way you can win it. Now what I'm saying is that these things are in the gut brain, and they are decisive, absolutely decisive. Why is it so important to keep Bosnia together? Because you cannot have an endless stream of secessions before it starts looking like 1861. And that, you see, was what the spokesman for Gorbachev, Gennady Gerasimov, a journalist, said when the Soviet Union started disintegrating, and Gorbachev was against it, Gerasimov was against it. But there were some Americans who were in favor of it, particularly the Baltic region. And then he said, okay, let's start talking 1861. So putting his finger at exactly that point. Now, the last trauma, the lost wars. Vietnam, and if you will, to some extent, Korea. So let us now take the CMT syndrome and put it together. What do we get? Chosen, myths, fantastic achievements in the past that are then reified and projected on the world, but the bitter pill of traumas. If you are chosen to run the world, you will have traumas because not everybody will agree with you. You will overstep, overreach, and you will hit walls and ceilings and limits. So let us now look at that again a little bit and try to explain something. Number one that I want to look into is the nuclear genocide on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And here is my thesis. And it is based on some very simple points. Point number one is that the decision to bomb Japan was taken in September 1944. At that point, there was nobody who could tell exactly which country would capitulate first. There was no way of saying that. It was taken by Roosevelt and Churchill. Second one, just one little footnote to that. Joseph Rotblat, the Nobel Prize winner, Peace Prize winner, the head, the soul behind the Pugwash conferences, a Polish English scientist, nuclear scientist, was working at the Los Alamos project, and he quit when it was decided that the bomb would not be used defensively against Germany. He didn't have any particular grudge against Japan. That actually applied to quite a lot of Europeans of Jewish extraction and also others concerned with the project. So why was it dropped on Japan? Was it in order to save GI lives or in order to frighten the Russians? Of course, both those things had a certain role. But I have a much simpler theory. It was the brain, the gut brain, that produced the consensus. Namely, whoever has committed a sacrilege of atrocities against US territory is in for severe punishment. The sacrilege was committed the 7th of December 1941. The punishment is not revenge. Revenge is what ordinary countries do. What countries that receive their mandate from God do is to punish them. And the punishment should be such a kind that they will not repeat their crime. It should also serve as a warning for others. I can, as a little footnote, say that this is probably the reason why the bomb has not been used afterwards, because the atomic powers were never exposed to that kind of sacrilege afterwards. And I'm thinking then particularly of the USA. The problem with historians is that they will not find any letter from Truman to his aunt talking exactly that language. Because the moment you are basing your research on written evidence, you are basing it on the individually conscious. The collectivity doesn't write. The individual writes only what is conscious. You may interpret. And I myself would be in the difficult position that I cannot prove it. I can only make predictions. And I can make quite a lot of them, as a matter of fact. And the basic prediction I make is, of course, the prognosis that this behavior will continue. In other words, violent action based on a quickly achieved consensus with no regard for non-violent alternatives will continue to be a major behavioral pattern of the US internationally, as long as nothing is done about CMNT, and in the end I'll come to some ideas about what could be done. Now, number 2, the Gulf War. Here, George Herbert Walker Bush said it. He said it. I think we have beaten the Vietnam syndrome once and for all. Now, the syndrome was not, I think, the inadvisability of land war in a jungle, partly because there was no jungle. What they did, in fact, was to run the tanks with plows after them, enormous plows, parallel to the trenches where the Iraqi soldiers were located, shooting as many Iraqi soldiers as they could, and what the plows did was to bury them, so that the sand came immediately. You can say a very cost-effective method of combining 2 operations. The numbers were enormous. IPPNW operates with 130,000 civilians and 180,000 military killed. During the war, 310,000 altogether. They were killed in spite of white flags of capitulation. Civilians escaping to Jordan in taxis and things of that kind were strafed from the sky, just killed, killed, killed. Now, why was this done, according to George Bush? I would say essentially in order to prove to the world that war is politics pursued with other means. In other words, to get beyond the idea that war is no longer an adequate means. Number 3, policy toward racist South Africa and Zionist Israel. Both these policies have changed recently. But the immediate policy was to curtail the black danger, I would say. And basically, South Africa was protected by the US for a very long period. I would say because it came into being the same way as the United States itself. And the same, of course, was the case with Israel. In other words, a chosen people in 1652 in South Africa. From the 1860s, via the conference in Basel at the end of the century, up until the declaration of independence and the creation of the Jewish state, finally by United Nations. What you protect is through isomorphism oneself. Again, the gut feeling, again, the consensus. Again, the tremendous difficulty in working against it. Because what the brain can do against the gut brain is not very much. It can only be done by myriads of concrete action, by myriads of Palestinian children, and in the South African case, incidentally, also children. The Soweto revolt and the Intifada. I could say that the Cold War was essentially a projection of the threat image that develops out of the CMT complex. If you are chosen and traumatized, you will see enemies everywhere, and they will threaten you. We still haven't seen any single concrete evidence that the Soviet Union ever planned an unprovoked attack on Western Europe, leaving alone the United States. Does that mean that they were peaceful, peace-loving? Not at all. They were just waiting for capitalism to collapse, because both Marx, Lenin, and Stalin had promised them that that would happen. It was totally unnecessary. Just sit and wait. Demoralization set in at the beginning of the 1970s, when it was quite clear that this would not happen. From that time on, the Soviet Union was dead. It was not a military victory, it was not an economic arms race victory. It was essentially the death of an ideology and a prophecy. But it was not perceived that way. It was perceived within a language that reached an enormous level of consensus, I would say, because it was compatible with CM and T. I could take the Cuba policy. It is said again and again in many writings by leading American politicians how the US is an example for the US, for America, and for the world. But the manifest destiny was, of course, particularly for America. Now, what this means is that that little irritant of the revolution in Cuba, which could have been handled beautifully by saying how fascinating that you make that experiment, we'll be willing to support you up to a certain point. We would advise you to have elections and respect human rights. We would be interested in what you're doing, and we might even have some money for investment. When it comes to the confiscations, let's discuss them one by one. We are willing to admit that we have made errors in the past. The Platt system was wrong from the very beginning. The 1898 war was wrong. In other words, let us sit down and try to reconcile. If that was the course that had been taken, Castro would have disappeared after 5 years. Investing in Cuban socialism would have been much more dangerous than what was done afterwards. But that was not the course taken. I think the basic point was that they had to be punished. They had to be punished for doing the unspeakable. Even if this was not primary sacred territory, it was secondary sacred territory belonging to the Americans. It was, in a sense, against the sacred territory as defined by the Monroe Doctrine. And you can then at the end take the UN policy. The UN policy is not only Jesse Helms's policy. Even if the UN has a certain popularity in the American people, the negative attitude is very well distributed among the elites. And I think it stems from one very simple factor. The moment UN can establish rules by which the US has to abide, the mystique of being God's most chosen country disappears. There's no space for UN between God and the US. The relation is too tight. So what I'm saying then is that I think this is going to continue, and let me now devote the list to some thoughts about what can be done about it. That, of course, brings in, if you will, psychoanalysis. And it brings in the old story about how many psychoanalysts are needed to change a bulb. As you will remember, the answer is not 2 or 3, or 4, 5, or 6. It's not only 1, it is 0, because the bulb has to want to change itself. And only the moment the bulb takes that decision can you really get business going. Is the bulb willing to change itself? Millions of Americans are. Millions. Now, one point here is that those millions who are willing to change and define the US as a normal country belonging to the human race will run up against a problem. They have 2 possibilities. Either they say it or they don't say it. Now, if they say it, they have to negate C, M, or T at some point. They have to say, look, gentlemen, America was not brought about by divine providence to lead the world. We are one country among many. We are big, but we are not even the biggest. Let's sit down and have a dialogue. The moment I say that, chosenness disappears. About the myths, libraries have been written that all these myths are partly correct and partly wrong. About the traumas, ladies and gentlemen, yes, we lost the Vietnam War. We made mistakes. That doesn't mean that we have to continue fighting the Vietnam War for a couple of centuries more. The moment you say all that, you may certainly become professor of peace studies, but it's not obvious that you'll become a leading politician of the United States of America. The moment Jimmy Carter says that America is a sick society, it's not a statement that creates great enthusiasm among the patients, to put it mildly. So your second possibility is that you don't say it, you just keep it as a secret, and you are elected. And then one day, in your weekly speech to the American people, you say, fellow Americans, I'm going to give a somewhat novel new speech today, whereupon you start attacking CMNT and you go through the whole rest. And you say, look, we people at the top are not the elite who are making decisions. What in fact happens is that these things are making us elites. The decisions are elite makers rather than the elites being decision makers. We are run by our gut brains and those syndromes. Now, I'm not expecting that the US president will talk in that semi-psychoanalytical language. But I'm just saying that his life expectancy after that speech might be somewhat limited. There are US presidents who have disappeared for less than that. For that reason, he now gets into another problem. What does he do, not the day after, but the minute after the speech? Well, he may disappear. He may simply take his security and go to one of those bunkers that are prepared for the case of nuclear war. But that doesn't work either, you see. So let us go back to that figure and say, it would be extremely useful if more elite figures could simply say, these things that we subconsciously seem to believe in do not make us strong. They may ultimately ruin us. They are the ones that may drive us to the precipice. And after that we suffer the decline and fall of all other empires who incidentally believed in exactly similar things. The Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the British Empire, you have them all the same. Now, if we want to be strong and be free, we rather liberate ourselves from that. And here, of course, one possibility would be to say, let us call in a superior source of morality. Now, that superior source is usually called God. And here the problem is that God has already been co-opted. God is not only a Republican, as we heard, but an American Republican. So that means from that point of view, there isn't that much to get from God, unless you start reading the things in a new way. You might then say, okay, if he has been co-opted and to some extent corrupted, how about the other religions? This, ladies and gentlemen, is a rather basic reason why Islam and Buddhism are spreading extremely much in the United States of America today. Exactly in order to find alternative sources of legitimation. Elites, possible but limited. God, possible but limited. How about the people? Now, this is what Americans do. This is what makes Americans loved around the world. All over the world you find thousands, I would say millions, of diligent, hard-working, humanity-inspired, globally conscious Americans. Up there, front of the NGOs, whenever the United Nations has a major conference, you will find this enormously talented volunteerism, the social skills, the emotional attachment, the hard work, the conscious brain behind it. US citizens doing fantastic work. In other words, you can say that what happens is actually that people do what the country should do, and what the country sometimes does. It does not only do bad things. Sometimes it does good things. Although the martial aid can also, of course, be explained by what the psychologists called reaction formation, an unacceptable impulse, namely aggressiveness, is mastered by going to the other extreme in an exaggerated behavior, so that somehow one compensates for the other with the hope that the sum is zero. So I would say that if I should place my bets on God, the elites, and the people, I may be saying people number one, God number two, but in somewhat changed fashion, and elites I would be more skeptical. Not because Mr. Dole doesn't know history. That might sometimes be an advantage. But because when I listen to him, I hear CMT, 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 CMT all the time. When I first time listened to Clinton, I thought I heard something else. And then I have a feeling that he was engulfed and taken over. Let me now end this by some words about history. History plays an enormous role in this. The less you know about it, the more quickly you forget it, the more will you be its slave. If you drive into Washington and you take to the right at Constitution Avenue, you come to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. It's a fantastic museum. I cannot enough recommend it, what I know of it. But there is, of course, a critical remark. It is somebody else's Holocaust. The museum should be in Berlin, maybe one day it will be in Berlin. But then you can argue against that with two arguments. You can say, were the Germans the only ones responsible for the Holocaust? Or was that a product of pathological features in the human race? In Hitler's case, you had CMT extremely high. And I could give the same talk about Hitler, not as a person, but as a phenomenon. So you can say that by having it in Washington, you have it at the center of the world's arbiter. And by putting it there, you are passing every day a more universally valid judgment than would be the case in Berlin. I'll buy 10% of that argument. You can also say that if you look at what the US Army did not do in connection with Auschwitz, you can say that there is some very concrete responsibility, but I don't think that was a major factor. But then you can say, and that's the most sad reflection, by buying into somebody else's Holocaust, the United States is liberating itself from its own. The Red Holocaust, David Stannard's excellent book, Oxford University Press, 1992, American Holocaust, comes up with 10 million Native Americans killed over a period of 300 years, 1600 to 1900. The Black Holocaust, in both cases combined with the destruction of two continents that were deprived of structure, culture, and perhaps some of the people who would have kept them vigorous. Now, it's very easy if you take Constitution Avenue a little bit further into the mall and you look over the whole territory, including towards the waters, to find sufficient space for two more Holocaust memorials. Would that help? I would say yes. I think the way the Holocaust Memorial that we know is being run with countless seminars, reflection, and so on, is just the right way to do it. I would have preferred somewhat more about how could it have been avoided, and how can we avoid repetitions, and somewhat less emphasis on the history of what happened, because it could have been avoided. Now, the Red and the Black Holocausts are in the same category. So the recommendations would be for a common therapeutical cause. And I think in a sense, one can draw some inspiration from the way in which the United States of America has handled the Civil War. We are, as we all know, 130 years hence, Appomattox. Appomattox, incidentally, was the 9th of April, which is the worst day in Norwegian history. That is when the Germans attacked us. So anything that happens the 9th of April, we will immediately say is bad. So that is why I had these lyrical tones in connection with Virginia and George Mason. But I'd be willing to repeat it for any lecture in New York at any time. Now, or up in Yankeelandia in general. I think it has been useful to repeat that history again and again and again. If you put on the History Channel, you will have the Civil War fought about 3 times every day. 8 o'clock Manassas, 12 o'clock Manassas 2, and then you go on and you have the midnight session of the Civil War. That's Monday. Tuesday's program will be 4 times the same thing. I think it is useful. I think those markers are useful. Because I know what the opposite is. The opposite, and this is my final remark, I experienced one day as a somewhat younger Director General, newly elected, of the Inter-University Center in Dubrovnik, Yugoslavia at that time. We had the first council meeting. My colleagues were Yugoslavs. And I felt that might be a good idea, so at the end of the meeting I said, could somebody please tell me a little bit about the relation between Serbs and Croats right now? This was in 1973. Total silence. Everybody looked down. So I understood that I had done something wrong. In French it's called a gaffe. So I said, when we look at page 3 in the budget, I am struck by, and things like that, nonsense of that type. After the meeting was over, 2 guys actually came up to me and said, don't you ever say that again, that question. The relation is horrible, but we are not permitted to talk about it. When I was lecturing on one US some points about the Red and Black Holocaust to my Princeton students some years ago, they all looked down, put aside their pens. They were all straight A, brilliant students, heading straight for the TNCs, Pentagon, CIA, and whatever. 3% even for intellectual work. And just sat there waiting till this fool from Norway was through with that kind of stuff. In other words, taboo and silence is not the way. Thank you so much.
It's all my fault. And in line with that, we don't wish to have any taboo or silence about what you may wish to say by way of a response. We have at least 20 minutes or 30 minutes for questions and comments and your discourse with Johan on his views on American history and its role in the world.
Mr. Galtung, I'm very much in sympathy with everything you said about the way our government is conducting our affairs. But I'm getting increasingly discouraged now about the media and its failure to at least try to keep American people more or less informed about things. We've got all these bus bombings in Israel, never mentioned in the American press, as far as I'm aware, except deep in the New York Times about the Israeli assassinations of the Palestinian leaders in the middle of this winter, just before the bus bombings.
Well, that is exactly the point. I mean, you would expect the kind of thing, if there's something to what I say, you would expect it to be reflected in mainstream media. And New York Times is mainstream except perhaps for page 67, down in the bottom left corner, once in a while, as you indicate. There is always that little niche where something else comes in. I could go further. I could say that the people who consciously make use of this kind of thing would be cynical politicians and public relations firms of the Hill and Knowlton, Ruder Finn types that you find in Washington, D.C. And they are responsible, according to one study, by Covert Action Quarterly, for about 40% of the foreign news that you can read in US media, by simply placing it. One of them worked for Sarajevo, and one of them worked for Croatia. The one that worked for Croatia was the one that worked for Kuwait and produced the story of the babies in the incubators and produced the story, if you will, of by drilling the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to testify for Congress. Now that was all revealed, but Hill and Knowlton is in excellent health and continued serving the Croats. I'm saying that because some of it is just what you would expect in a country where truths produced in conformity with the gut brain will be printed, and truth that is against it will at best end up on page 67.
Yes, could people come to the microphone because we're recording this? Or if you feel uncomfortable about that, just talk from where you are.
This is Alicia in a captain's uniform.
Yeah, when you were talking about not disturbing the CMTs, one time when we did try to was the 60s of Vietnam, and of course it was violently repressed. Do you think like maybe every 30 years it might come back again? And in some way we become more aware of this. That's one question. The other thing is the other day you were talking about Somalia, and you said one reason that starvation was involved, but one reason it didn't follow the normal course of events that we were trying to mobilize our agriculture is that they were trying to use it as an experiment to implement Agenda 21. I mean, I didn't quite understand all that. If you want to get into that, it's a separate story.
I didn't mention Somalia.
Was it Ethiopia?
No.
Something about Agenda 21.
Something about
Agenda 21.
On another occasion?
Yeah, it's the other day, but today, if you just want to talk about the
You see,
60s.
Alicia, I mentioned that when I was talking in World Bank and you were there, so you're just combining my talks. But I think a basic point that I could make about Somalia would be this. It's often said that the US has no particular stake in Somalia, and I think the oil point that is made by the critics is a marginal point, to be quite frank. There was a stake, and it was to show the military with a human face. And I find that, in a sense, positive. But of course it has to work. And the theory behind the Somalia action, UNISOM 1 and 2, and the way it started back in December 1992, I think was seriously flawed. But I would analyze this more at the conscious level. I would not see Somalia in terms of CMT operating, except in the more general term of being the conflict manager around the world. And when this then obviously didn't work, then very quick withdrawal. One should remember, in a sense, that if you take Arthur Schlesinger's analysis of the cycles in US foreign policy, he talks about expansion, contraction. Another way of saying it is that you have cycles with global consciousness, where the US is reaching out, global reach, as Richard Barnett would say in his famous book, and you have isolationism. And isolationism, in a sense, was the reaction to the failure in Somalia. If you don't like us, okay, you don't deserve us. And this is my interpretation of what Buchanan stands for. Then that what he stands for essentially is this: we are too good for you guys abroad. And that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with America. There's something very basically wrong about you. And let us now just try to put our own house in order. Now, the rhetoric that surrounds this one is seriously flawed in very many regards. But I certainly see him as an expression of Schlesinger Phase 2, and that the reaction to Somalia was, if you will, of that kind.
Dr. Galtung, it's often argued that peace is not a possible phenomenon without the idea of justice. And one of the things that I'm interested in is how often in international affairs the idea of justice and the idea of revenge are confused and used interchangeably. So I was wondering if you could share some thoughts on that, please.
Of course, revenge is usually the reaction to defeat. And it comes in one way or the other. For instance, I would guess that the Japanese economic invasion of the United States was in a sense a revenge for the lost war, at least one aspect of it. Because if you look at Japan from a CMT aspect, you will find much of the same. And you can say that over the Pacific War, God and the Sun Goddess were fighting, and the Sun Goddess lost, and the Sun Goddess comes back. Now, to eke out some justice in the struggle between such giants is not easy. I'm struck by the fact that it seems that small countries are better at doing it. There are 28 countries in the world right now without armies. The most famous one, and probably by a guy called Niccolo Machiavelli. But they found the idea too Machiavellian, so they didn't accept it. Now, in 1793, the argument was, Frenchmen, you live in the first real country in the world with human rights and implicitly social justice. You owe to your country to give your life when that country says so. You'll find quite a lot of this in US presidential rhetoric in connection with wars. So I'm just saying it works in a very kind of cynical way both ways, unfortunately.
Two questions, Dr. Galtung. One is, it seems to me that in my research that, just as an example, Mennonitism is a perfect example of CMT. There's a sense of chosenness, there's shared myths, and there's a serious trauma in history.
And the Mennonites.
Yes,
yep.
And yet they're the leading peacemakers in the world. So I'm wondering whether CMT is in fact not a definition of group identity, and it's how that CMT is negotiated. That's number one. And number two, as far as collective unconscious, a lot of, in your categorizations, Jungian collective unconscious is pretty critical. And I'm just wondering whether you believe in free will, individual free will, and if so, is collective unconscious not contradictory to that? And if that is the case, what is the point of talking about social change? Because it seems to me to be a form of collective analysis of whole populations that have some sort of personality in common, where change is not possible. So I'd like to,
Thanks for fascinating questions. I agree with you completely with your analysis of the Mennonites, and I could add others. I think in a sense you could add the Quakers too. You could add certain Buddhist sects. And I would say if you're dealing with cases, you use the expression negotiated CMT complexes, and I would say process transformed. It reminds me of something that Martin Buber used to say about Zionism. And there are other leading Jewish thinkers who have said something of the same. They do not reject the idea of chosenness. But the question is, chosen for what? I remember the former director of Mossad, Yehoshaphat Harkavi, who was a brigadier in the Israeli army, and incidentally a good friend of mine. He used to say that interpret chosenness and promised land not in terms of acreage, but in terms of quality. And Martin Buber spoke about true coexistence and togetherness among the three religions. So that way you can keep the sea, but you transform it. And you don't say, excuse me for the expression, nonsense like what Colin Powell used in order to get a round of applause. And here I chose on purpose Colin Powell because he's a nice guy. I could have chosen somebody who doesn't even look nice, and he would have said the same. So this is just, if you will, one little way of trying to show that it is rather well distributed. Now, the free will, the definition that I go by is this: we're free to the extent that we understand the forces that are working on us. If we don't understand them, then we are the slaves of those forces. Freud made us the favor, although there is lots of Freud bashing around today, of showing something in the inner world. Marx did us the favor of showing us something in the outer world, in the social structure, that the class consciousness was ruling us. Combine Freud and Marx, and you might say, where is free will now? And I would say, yes, it is there, to the extent you're able to come on top of those forces. That doesn't mean that you can eliminate them, but you can somehow say, when I say this, it is probably partly because of that, so let me now think once again. And thereby you create your freedom and your space. And for that reason we get social change. I don't think social change is only due to the sort of automated response of the underdog against repressive structures. If that were the case, we would just have been going by a pendulum, back and forth. In fact, human history shows quite a lot of imagination, innovation all the time. So, I guess we'll get out of this one too. I'll only say that since I have been working recently on the history, fall and decline of 10 empires, that US is on the road. And that is exactly because the failure to understand what is driving it reduces the freedom, the free space. Thanks again for your questions.
You have mentioned that you have most faith in the American people to bring about some change. I'd like to mention one little example of what two retired people have been able to do. They asked Oscar Arias what might be done to help the process of demilitarization. You mentioned the 28 countries. He suggested that Haiti is one of the countries where the people don't see the military as a protector, but rather as a danger to their life. And if he had $20,000, he could conduct an opinion poll that could show whether that is indeed true. And they were able to raise that money, and the poll was conducted. And when Arias announced the results that 62% are in favor of abolishing the army, 12% of Haitians want to keep it, President Aristide spontaneously declared the army abolished. I'd like to mention that story to encourage people that sometimes a very small step can have fairly large consequences.
Beautiful story, Professor Fischer. I like it very much. And I must, to do some name dropping again, say that I was once visiting professor at the University of Essex in England. It's the first time abroad as a Norwegian that I was giving a course in peace studies. And there was a very modest little guy sitting at the end of the room, the kind of guy the professor would, practically speaking, never notice. And his name was Oscar Arias Sanchez. And I'm not saying that he has it from me, absolutely not. I'm just saying that I know the guy. And the idea, just get $20,000 and make the invisible visible. Name that 62% don't want that army, and you abolish it. In a somewhat similar way, also to a large extent due to Oscar Arias Sanchez, the army of Panama disappeared. You may remember that the Organization of American States, against one vote, condemned George Bush's invasion of Panama in December 1989. The one vote was United States. And the US ambassador was furious, and so was the foreign minister, saying that We gave you a chance to get out of your formalistic thinking about intervention. Well, they didn't see it that way. The president, the successor to Noriega, was seen as a US stooge. No other country recognized Panama. Then Sanchez brought about a deal. Costa Rica will recognize you if you abolish the army. Fair deal. Army out, recognition in, and thus it went. Now, this is again, you can see, the persistent work of one guy, Oscar Arias Sanchez, who just goes on and on and on and on and on, and after that he continues going on and on. Great praise to him.
John.
I was noticing that your ideas are focused on national CMT complexes. Have you identified any international CMT complexes? I mean, is there a UN myths that are starting to evolve, or European Union myths that are starting to evolve that you have identified?
Absolutely, and thanks for the question. Let me start with the European Union. It's filled to the brim. I can just characterize it, but you see, you're now you're tapping a Norwegian who played some role in the Norwegian no to joining the European Union. So stop me before I have talked 1 hour about it. The C aspect, you see, typical of Europeans is a little bit the French idea that we are not chosen by God like you people are. Because to be chosen by God means that there is somebody above us. And that would be the kind of thing we couldn't tolerate at all. So the French, who are the leaders in this field, are simply self-chosen. And that for them is good enough. Un peuple élu, mais par lui-même. Now, the French are the ones who somehow inspire the European Union ethos. And they have filled very much of that. So it's cradle of history, civilization. There is a vulgar version of it to the left over the Atlantic called America, and so on. And then another vulgar version called Russia. So that brings us to a key trauma. First of all, our self-destruction. Our total inability to keep peace. If you just look at the 5 leading powers in the European Union, and they are England, France, Germany, Spain, and Italy, you have a pentagon. And if you look at the 10 bilateral lines, I can fill you with the history of warfare along all lines. Now, to that they say, but look, that's history. We have now come together, and a war among us is inconceivable. Right after they say that, Europe reconstitutes itself in Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox, Muslim Europe. The 3 meet in Sarajevo, and you see what happened. In other words, European Union is firmly Protestant Catholic. No Orthodox Slavic country needs apply. No Muslim country needs apply. And they know that. They draw the lines that way and firmly strengthen the old, if you will, fault lines of the European continent. That is, if you will, the trauma. The myth is, of course, the cradle of civilization, and that anything good comes from us, and whatever is good in the United States of America comes from European immigrants. We are willing to perhaps say the sons of European immigrants, but after that it gets diluted. So it's that kind of thinking. Will it become dangerous? I'm afraid yes. The Euro core and the possibility of putting the French atomic arms at the disposal of the Euro core. You can also, if you will, see the European Union, and this is my last comment, as an organization whereby Germany and England will support France and Spain in North Africa, on the condition that France and Spain support Germany in Eastern Europe, and all 3 of them support Britain all over the world, and particularly Northern Ireland. In other words, it's a common market, but with political currency. Good old mafia, I support you, you support me. And that's the way it'll be. And that's called European Union. Now, there was an ambassador for the European Union talking at ICAR today. Maybe he expressed it a different way. I don't know. When it comes to the United Nations, I see signs in exactly the same direction. And I could now give a talk that some militia people actually would like. Signs of arrogance, concealing facts, suffering because they don't have their independent spying organization, licking their wounds, and instead of being at the service of humanity, somehow demanding that humanity should serve them. And being filled with the idea that any decision taken on the 38th floor of that big building on the East River has a quality which is above the quality of anybody else. Now, that is dangerous. So we are talking about things that are profoundly human and that seem to come with big power, with bigness. Not by that saying that you cannot also find CMT complexes in Liechtenstein with 29,000 inhabitants. But it doesn't matter so much. I mean, let them have their CMT complex and enjoy it, if you will.
I'm just wondering what you think of the role, or whether there is a role for the NGOs in achieving global peace. You know, whether they really, are they going to ever be allowed to have some role? It's kind of the humanity, the people.
Dieter, will you switch on that little sheet again? I mean, just, you have it exactly right. Not exactly the way it is, just the light. That's it. You know, when I was talking, I tried to say that of these three factors, I would first of all gamble on people, then on God, and last on the elites. When it comes to God, I would ask God to be a little bit more modest. The God of the Bible, somebody has read the Bible and found 700 massacres, 100 of them ordained by God. I read to you the recipe in Deuteronomy 20 on what you should do, save the trees, which I do not read as environmentally sound politics, to put it that way. Now, when it comes to the people, that is the NGO, and that is the international civil society. And you see it all over the world. And you see it at the UN conferences, and maybe that is the lasting contribution of the United Nations, is to organize conferences where the state system and the non-state system are side by side. Imagine you did that in national democracies, it would be very invigorating. So I can only say that I think that to me represents the best hope of them all. Now, if they are so good, then you would predict that the elites would be jealous. And I'm sort of waiting for that to happen. That, for instance, a point will come where all conflict analysts will have to receive a certificate from the International League of Diplomats or something in order to operate. And that certificate will only be issued to reliable people. And I think you can imagine who will be on the certification board and who will not be there. You can imagine such things happening. So my prognosis will be that we are heading for some kind of conflict. And it's in our interest to try to handle that non-violently, peacefully, constructively. But on the other side, not be naive about it. I could then give you countless examples of how the people are able to change situations. Let me just say one, because it is not so well known. The 9th of October 1989, 1 month before the fall of the wall, 75,000 human beings, mostly women, were in the streets of Leipzig in eastern Germany. coming out of the 5 churches for the first time defying the state police power and showing with their bodies and their soul the courage of defiance. Well, that night the Cold War died. 1 month later the wall disappeared. So who brought it about? People. Then the negative side. It's also people who are killing in Yugoslavia. And not necessarily being told by the governments to do so. It's also NGOs that are running narcotics, and so on. So you know, it's always this doubleness to it, because there is a certain doubleness to us human beings. In other words, you somehow have to gamble on the good side and try to strengthen that all the time. But anyhow, this is where I would see the basic point, and this is where my unconditional praise of Americans come. And this is the reason why Americans are loved all over the world, you see. That kind of American.
We have time for one more question. A comment?
Lila Dane, I'd like to leave you with a challenge. I hope you can answer it. If you can't, maybe it'll produce a speech the next time. I'm familiar with the CMT complex. I enjoyed the way you presented it. I kept waiting for you to come forth with the logical conclusion of competing victimhood and how the action-reaction patterns are established with competing victimhood. I wonder... Competing victimhood. It takes the idea of the chosenness and the myths and the trauma and puts them in opposition with another group.
Well, I think I can take up that challenge right away. The Jews have an unfortunate habit of believing that they have a monopoly. When somebody says that there is a red Holocaust, a black Holocaust, when David Stannard writes a book called The American Holocaust, it doesn't in any sense diminish the horror we have for what happened to the European Jews. It only, in a sense, says that this is a phenomenon which unfortunately appears under certain circumstances. And I think it is generated by extreme versions of CMT. If you look at the Hitler, the chosenness was obvious. But he was a sly guy, you see. He was chosen by 2 gods at the same time. By a kind of combined evangelical Catholic God in order to please the churches of Germany, and Wotan, the Nordic God. Straight into Wagner. And he had, of course, the word that could cover both of them, providence. He had the myth of Aryan superiority at the expense of everybody else. And he had the trauma. And that's the only place where he got something relatively right of the way Germany was treated after the First World War. And when I indicated somewhat cryptically that we could have avoided that Holocaust, it would probably have been through a revising the Versailles Treaty. Now, I'm saying that when you generalize the Holocaust, you do not liberate the Germans or diminish the terrible horror suffered by the Jews. But you construct something that may make it more amenable to analysis and to treatment. Because if you limit the Holocaust to something einmalig, as the Germans say, something that happened once in history and that is all and just let us remember it, if you do that, you do a disservice. Because then you're just saying, essentially, okay, this was 1933 to 45, that was it, this was terrible. If you generalize it, then you might see the common features. and I regard that as a much better approach. Now, Stannard was attacked in the New York Book Review for the title of his book, American Holocaust. And it was pointed out by one reviewer who was then starting quibbling about numbers, how many were killed and how were they killed. And I remember Stannard's reply was that the major way in which European Jews was killed was not in the gas chamber, but by being worked to death. Exactly the same way it was done in Latin America. And then killed in that connection. The gas chamber is, of course, much more famous. So David had all kinds of figures for that, incidentally. But this is a kind of morbid competition as to who has suffered most that I am not going to enter. I'm much more interested in a much more important question: how do we avoid it in the future? Thank you.
Your acclamation has already more eloquently conveyed than I can our appreciation to Johan for reminding us that if the price of freedom is eternal vigilance, then the price of peace is a willingness to confront our traumas, our myths, and our chosenness, and to work with them and to try and transcend them. And I thank you very much, Johan, for doing that for us. I'm sure that that will be something that will guide many of us in our thinking about how we deal with peaceful relationships in the future, and how we generate peaceful relationships. Before we go, I'd like to thank all those who made this possible. I'd once again like to thank our benefactors, Ed and Helen Lynch, who gave us this lecture. I'd like to thank Marilyn Boland and Grace Morello and Joan Drake and all the others who, and Linda Johnson and others who combined to bring you all out here. And I'd like to thank all of you for taking your time to hear a challenging, provocative statement from one of the peace research community's founding fathers. And once again, on behalf of all of you, I'd just like to thank Johan very much for challenging us and giving us a mirror on ourselves and on the different futures which we might choose.